think I'm gonna walk down to the beach and see if I can find a cool scene. Look at this gorgeous, almost albino tree. Oh my gosh, you guys, it's the ocean. We found it. I mean, I knew we would eventually get there. Wow. You can actually see the waves. I think I'm gonna paint this scene that has like the scooping shoreline coming this way and the waves coming in. So I'll try to have fun with the composition there. And I'll just do a little watercolor to start off with on some smaller paper. This one I felt like doing a little more like exaggerated shapes, just like this is watercolor pencil, just coming back in on top of wet paint. I think I'll do a red one. Some of those distant rocks. But yeah, I think I'll call that one done. Just a fun little sketch to get me in the beach mode. So back in the studio, I had a chance to distill what I experienced in person, and the main thing that drew me to that beach scene was the really beautiful, soft, foggy atmosphere. Also, the horizon was invisible and the colors were very muted, which was just gorgeous. And I especially loved the textures in the sand and the stones that were all over the shore. So I really wanted to create a balance between the softness of the sky and the roughness of that shore. Just like the last lessons learned video I posted, I am gonna leave the video a little bit darker on this one because again, it's a very muted and soft painting and I just don't know how else to show it very well. So at the end I'll give you a close-up, an actual proper view of the finished painting so you can see the full tonal range and the colors. My first lesson learned was about color. In my study, I felt that the saturation and warmth of the colors I used made it look a little bit too much like it was a bright, sunny day. So I really forced myself to mix more muted tones. And to do this, I pretty much just added a tiny bit of the anthracnone blue and occasionally the neutral tint to all of my mixes. And this just automatically gave me a more overcast look, which was exactly what I needed. My second lesson learned was about perspective. In my study, I drew the shoreline at kind of an awkward angle, and this angle would not have been possible from my vantage point of sitting on the sand. I drew it more like, it would have been more like I was floating 30 feet up in the air. So in the studio version, I paid closer attention to the angle of the shoreline, and this is actually something I get wrong a lot in my seascapes, and I'm trying to remember every time I do it. So basically what I mean is the angle of the shore should be a little bit more parallel with me versus coming at me, unless I'm standing right next to the water. So back to colors. As I shifted into the foreground sand, I used a lot of Potter's Pink, and this is a very heavily granulating pigment which mixes beautifully with almost everything on my palette since it's a weaker color, and it's one of my favorite things to use in any kind of beach or coastal mix. I'm also adding in a bit of English Venetian red to give a little bit of pop of color there, but not too much, because in person the sand had quite a red tone to it. Here and there I'll touch in some neutral tint and a little bit of anthracone blue to just neutralize the colors a little and give more of a variety, because there's so much variety. There's not just one big solid color that makes up this shoreline. And since I'm at home and I have this conveniently next to my desk, I added salt to this first wash. And I did it when it's really wet so that I'll get the most effect. But basically, salt, when it dries, just leaves the most gorgeous, kind of spontaneous texture. And it lends itself beautifully to sandy scenes or anything with like a rough texture. And while this first layer was still wet, I wanted to lay in the first wash of the water layer so that it all kind of bled together and gave me that soft look that I was going for. I used muted tones here, so any of the blue I added, I made sure I mixed in just a hint of the neutral tint and diluted it quite a lot. So I did want to go for like a muted turquoise color, so I used a little bit of phthalo green, but very, very little because that color is so strong. And I felt like it gave me just the tiniest bit of pop that I needed, and especially because red and green are complementary colors, because my sand is a little bit more red, it automatically helps make my green feel a little bit more green. So that was a nice I actually didn't realize that was going to happen until I did it. Here's a little drying time lapse so you can see how dramatic the salt effect is. I just love watching this sped up. It's so cool. I do apologize here for the camera blur. It was trying to focus and it didn't know what to do. So I ended up zooming back out and it was a little bit better. But during this first layer of texture on the water, I was just going for really soft shadows that made it look like the waves were just starting to curl over. And I used a slightly darker version of the blue I had already laid down there. And occasionally you can see I'm using my finger to soften it because I really didn't want any super hard edges. Right where the shore meets the water, I added a little shadow there because I wanted to give a slight separation and indicate that the sand is a little bit more wet there. And I was just using a dry brush just to give, let the color kind of dust across the texture of the paper. So if you remember back to my study, I used a watercolor pencil to create the rocks in the foreground, but more in like an exaggerated, stylized way. So in the studio, I decided to experiment a little more with that, and I used my fan brush to I was basically just focusing on the shadows of the rocks rather than painting the rocks themselves. So I was using like little loops or half circles underneath where the rocks would be, and kind of layering it up here and there throughout the shore, trying not to get any repetitive pattern, because I feel like if you have a repetitive pattern or a visible pattern, it gets a little bit too unrealistic. And this technique worked surprisingly well, so it might be something I'll revisit in the future and work a little bit more on. Then I added a few splashes of color just to get a more prominent texture there. And after that, I just kind of looked at it for a while, figuring out what else I would want to add to it, and realized I did want to come back with a few darker stones, because in person there were actually quite a few larger stones, like much bigger than my hand, so those would be clearly visible. And I thought if I kind of dotted the shoreline with a few of those, it'll lend itself to look like a more rough shore like it actually was in person. I really hope you guys have been enjoying this little series. It's a lot of fun for me because looking back at my footage and the paintings, it actually teaches me a lot about my own lessons. It makes me look at it more thoroughly, and I've learned so much when doing it. Also, with these more muted paintings, I am learning a ton about color mixing and water control. So if anyone is struggling in those areas, I really do recommend trying a more muted or foggy scene because of what it requires. So I think I'm going to leave this here, and I'll show you a close-up of the painting so you can get an idea of the final textures and everything. Let me know if you guys have any questions or if you want to see anything in particular in the future. I was thinking about doing a mountain scene soon, but I'm waiting for the lockdown to end so I can drive to the mountains. Anyways, I hope you guys are staying well, and I'll see you again soon.